Hello and welcome back to the Script Monk Screenwriting channel where I give you the hard stuff you gotta put right in your veins! Whenever I'm in some group discussing screencraft, the subject inevitably turns to story structure. And there's always someone in the group who just gets angry! No! Structure bad! I denounce you, tyrannical oppressor! And some of these are like highly educated people, but I'll use a convenient phrase like rules of screencraft and they're all,
don't commit your hate crimes here! Hate crime!
But then I realize, oh wait, you don't actually understand what story structure actually is. Because if you did, you'd realize how silly you're being. But then you got the opposite type, your structure Nazi, who's all, it has to happen on page 30, it has to happen this way! Why? Because the book says so! Does it give a reason? No, but it's so lots of copies, so it has to be correct! Oh wait, you don't understand what story structure actually is either. Because then you'd realize how incredibly flexible things are. First of all, for the former group, a story without structure is literally impossible. In fact, one of the qualities that defines a story is the fact that events are related in a structured order. Say you're just telling a friend about the weird thing that happened the other day. Without even thinking about it, you put your story into a structure. First, you establish where you were and who was there. Then you introduce the weird thing that made the story worth telling. Then you relate one after another the events that followed. Then you wrap things up with some sort of concluding statement. You structure things automatically. Why? Because without some sort of logical shape and order, your friend wouldn't be able to understand the story. Because we interpret the meaning of story events by how they are structurally connected to other events. But when we go from just jabbering to our friends to storytelling in an actual formal medium, like the feature-length film, this basic structure has to become more specialized. Now, I can't cover every form of movie storytelling, so I'm going to limit myself to just the big, bloated beluga whale of screencraft, the source of both the structure-phobes' rage and the structure Nazis' toe-stepping, the commercial Hollywood three-act structure. And to help explain, I've invited a special guest, renowned film critic and theorist, Mr. Charles Darwin. Mr. Darwin, could you please tell us why Hollywood films have developed their particular structure?
Oh, well...
Allow us to form a biological analogy. In every ecosystem, you'll find a host of creatures perfectly adapted to that environment. Of particular note are what we call morphological adaptations, the way the creature's body is shaped to fit certain aspects of the environment. Now, according to Darwin, this is no coincidence. See, sexual reproduction randomly mixes and matches the genes of two parents. The offspring are then thrown into the life or death game of natural survival. This essentially turns the history of every species into trillions of individual experiments to see which genes are best fit for survival. Those lucky enough to have useful traits live and pass on those traits. Those that don't fail and die. And as this continues over the generations, the species becomes more and more specialized until it reaches a point where we might say it is perfectly adapted to survival in its particular ecosystem. But what determines the perfect fit? Well, it's never just one or two things, but dozens of environmental factors. Things like the average temperature, the availability of water, the type of terrain, available nutrient sources, the presence of predators. And it might take thousands of years of genetic experimentation to finally thread all these needles to find the morphology that is the perfect fit for every single factor. My point is, the environment determines the right morphology. Life must adjust to it. So if you're a morphological misfit, you're not going to survive. A polar bear might be the king of the Arctic, but if you put it in the jungle, it's gonna die. Likewise, if you dropped a bunch of monkeys into the desert, you're gonna wind up with a bunch of dead monkeys. They just don't fit. Now what the hell does this have to do with storytelling? Well, stories are a bit like life forms. The life here being the natural human urge to artfully express ourselves. Now, art is defined as a communication through a creative medium. That medium part is important because every story is told within a particular environment. And to do well, the story must be shaped into a form adapted to the necessities of that environment. As an example, let's return to you telling your friend about the weird thing that happened the other day. Let's say you're in a restaurant. You automatically tailor your story to fit the environment. First of all, because restaurants are full of distractions, you keep things simple and to the point. Second, because of all the distractions, your chief concern is making sure your friend understands the story. So you clearly set things up, oversimplify some things while emphasizing your key points. But when we move to a venue like the feature-length film, these environmental factors become far more numerous and far more complex. And we can see a slow adaptation to this environment in the evolution of the Hollywood film since its inception. In the earliest days, people didn't know what the hell they were doing. It took 2 to 3 decades for filmmakers to figure out the proper language for storytelling in this new medium. Then a meteor struck called the introduction of sound, and Hollywood needed another 10 years to work out how to best tell stories with this new environmental factor. Yet by the 1940s, Hollywood evolved into its classical stage, where techniques had become clean and polished, and effective tropes and formulas had been developed that audiences liked again and again. But to our modern eye, these are just but elegant dinosaurs, clunky, contrived, and unrealistic. This is because Hollywood storytelling has continued to evolve in response to new changes in its environment. Things like the dismantling of the studio system, the introduction of the competing species known as television, new film technologies, more sophisticated audiences with greater demands. Yet as old Chuck Darwin here tells us, no evolution occurs without the constant threat of death. And indeed, every commercial film lived or died by the box office. Because of this, commercial success became the measuring stick for how well storytelling methods fit into the movie environment. So, just like Mother Nature, Hollywood retained the qualities that succeeded and abandoned those that failed. So, through all the decades of successes and failures, Hollywood storytelling has become more refined and more specialized in the quest to find the perfect morphological form that would succeed every single time. And as a result, the Hollywood mode of storytelling has evolved into the apex predator of the commercial film environment. Thus, we can say what story structure actually is. Story structure is a morphological adaptation to the factors of a particular storytelling environment. Whether we're talking about movies, comics, or anime, without the proper structural adaptations, a story will be unfit for that environment. And given the competitive nature of entertainment, it's gonna die. Now, I'm gonna list some of the factors that have shaped Hollywood storytelling. But to fend off any angry or misguided comments, I have to make certain points up front. First of all, none of this should be taken to mean that the Hollywood method is the only way to construct a commercial feature film. This is merely the path that Hollywood's evolution took. At any point, it could have gone a completely different direction, evolving into a completely different structure that works just as well. See, in every ecosystem, there are dozens of creatures perfectly adapted in their own way. So hypothetically, there may be many alternative structures that work just as well in the Hollywood environment, as proven by the occasional success of some films like Pulp Fiction or Forrest Gump. Second, if you change just one environmental factor, this will change what constitutes the ideal story structure. It's just like a mathematical equation. If you change one value, it changes the entire solution. Now, the most obvious example would be like a change in cultural milieu. What flies well for American audiences may not work for any international audience, because it's a different environment. Third, evolution tends to ride the horse in the direction it's going, meaning it stays on its path to adjust and refine what it already has instead of making any sudden radical departures. So we can see a slow, steady through line from the classical Hollywood of the 40s to the Hollywood movies of today. But of course, every year there are filmmakers who do make radical departures. However, just like genetic mutations in nature, most of these experiments fail. And by fail, I mean at the box office. And since Hollywood is a profit-driven industry, it sees no reason to imitate these failures, and they end up being evolutionary dead ends. Which leads to the most important point I want to make. If you dislike Hollywood storytelling, if you want to experiment with something radically different, you cannot ignore the existing factors of the storytelling environment. Otherwise, you're making a monkey to drop in the desert, and that monkey's gonna die. The Hollywood mode has evolved into the apex predator by conforming to the necessities of its environment. If you want to swim in the same ocean, you gotta do the same thing. You don't have to do things the same way, but in a way that still meets those environmental requirements. If you want to work in a different storytelling environment, you gotta recognize the factors of that environment and structure your stories accordingly. Otherwise, whatever the case, you'll end up with a misfit lacking the necessities for survival. So what are these environmental factors you must not ignore? Well, I can't go over them all in detail, so I'll simply introduce each broad factor with one example. Also, keep in mind this is a non-exclusive list. Well, the first and foremost factor are the physical properties of cinema itself. Every form of storytelling, movies, literature, theater, comic books, has things it can do and things it cannot do. As such, each form has its own strengths, requirements, and limitations. So an ideal cinematic story is one that plays to cinema's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. For example, you're told it's best to show, don't tell. This is because motion pictures are best suited to narratives that develop through movement, action, and change. Cinema is spectacle-oriented, meaning it's directed at a visual spectator. This is why Shakespeare tends not to do well when adapted into movies without severe alterations. Shakespeare is adapted to the theater, which is a far more static story environment, so it's dropping a monkey into the desert. The second factor is the prescribed length of the feature film. Notwithstanding Hollywood's recent habit of chubby chasing, this length has been standardized at 90 to 125 minutes. And part of the reason Hollywood act structure has developed into its current form was the need to find the perfect amount of plot to fill this length of time. Too little plot and the story moves like pond water. Too much plot and it becomes cluttered and hard to follow. Hollywood act structure is designed to hit that perfect Goldilocks zone. Not too much, not too little. However, this means the structure must be adjusted if instead we're making a 45-minute television episode, a 9-minute short film, or a 6-hour miniseries, because a different length will require a different structure. Now, one reason Hollywood settled on this length is monetary. It gives viewers a bang for their buck while still allowing a certain number of screenings per day. Which brings us to the factor that writers most hate to acknowledge: the commercial orientation of the film industry. I've said it before on this channel. Though they may hate it, every professional screenwriter must eventually admit a simple reality. And that's cream. Cash rules everything around me. Dollar, dollar bill, yo. Movies cost an enormous amount of money. And that money isn't coming from the artist, but from investors. And in any business, investors want their money back plus profit. So as far as the industry is concerned, the chief goal of every movie is to appeal to a large enough audience to make more money than it costs. The bigger the budget, the broader its appeal must be. So a huge part of Hollywood evolution has been the life or death struggle to figure out what story forms tend to be most successful with the most moviegoers in order to ensure each film's survival. However, if a film can be made inexpensively, or if you're lucky enough to be in a situation where profitability isn't a concern, there's much less risk in trying something different, with the understanding that you'll likely appeal to a much smaller audience. Or you might hit on something audiences love. Because when I say a film lives or dies by the box office, what this really means is it lives or dies by the audience. And that's important, because no matter your intentions, commercial or otherwise, you absolutely cannot ignore the most crucial factor in the cinematic ecosystem: the needs and expectations of your viewing audience. If you don't succeed with viewers, you're dead. Plain as that. They are the predators that will eat you alive. Viewers come to movies with certain desires and expectations, the simplest being that the story makes sense, that it's interesting, that they enjoy spending time with the characters, and it gives them some sort of emotional pleasure. And again, Hollywood storytelling has evolved over the years in the quest to find the ideal forms to consistently give viewers what they want and need. However, there's one big difference between how we watch movies and how we consume other media. Unlike, say, reading a novel where we must actively involve ourselves in imagining the story, watching a movie is a purely passive experience. The movie's just projected onto our eyeballs and we can ignore it if we wish. For this reason, we have much shorter attention spans when watching movies than with other media. So, movie story structure is designed to counter this, presenting stories in ways meant to grab viewer attentions and get them mentally involved in the story, turning them into active viewers. A big part of sequence and act structure is the recognized need to constantly re-engage audience interest at regular intervals, because if nothing significant happens for 7 to 8 minutes, their attentions will begin to wander. So much of story structure is just keeping the audience from getting bored. But on the topic of the audience, we end on the most invisible and often the most powerful factor in the storytelling environment: the cultural background of artists and audience. We're all a member of one culture or another, some of us more than one. And as members of a culture, we have been instilled with certain philosophies regarding how the world should work and how people ought to behave. And as I've touched on when discussing movies as modern mythology, these cultural philosophies strongly influence the stories we create and the type of stories we respond to. For example, the United States is a capitalist democracy. In fact, it likes to see itself as the capitalist democracy. And since Hollywood movies are largely created by American artists and aimed primarily at American audiences, it's no surprise to find capitalist democratic philosophies infused right into the narrative structure. Time and again, we have individual heroes with the freedom to pursue their own happiness and success. However, this must be earned through hard work, sacrifice, self-improvement, and the allegiance to certain moral principles. Not to mention how American philosophies have been shaped by Judeo-Christian values, especially Protestant values. And I'm always amused by how the Hollywood character arc so often mimics Protestant theologies on human salvation. This is why Hollywood movies are so often accused of cultural imperialism. The tenets of American philosophy are embedded right into the narrative. To wit, Hollywood movies are not received in the same way by international audiences, because they represent a different cultural ecosystem. And you'll find that each national cinema will develop its own specialized story structure, evolve to match the cultural attitudes of its own audience. Now, none of this is set in stone. Every factor is subject to change, and any change will also alter what constitutes the ideal story structure. For example, recently movies have been getting longer, and streaming is affecting the way Hollywood tells its stories. Meanwhile, audiences change over time as they grow more media literate and more accustomed to story conventions. So, bottom line, the Hollywood story structure has evolved into its current form in response to the factors of the environment it must live or die within. And whether you like Hollywood movies or not, whether you want to do things the same or differently, whether you want to work inside or outside the commercial film industry, you must make the same considerations. Because your story will exist within a particular storytelling environment. And to survive, it needs a structure that meets the requirements of that environment. You don't have to do things the same way Hollywood does it. In fact, if you're in a different environment, that's actually a bad idea. But you must recognize the environmental factors and find a proper morphology that is a perfect fit. Otherwise, you're just dropping a monkey into the desert. And there's nothing sadder than to wind up with a dead monkey.
I will remember you.
Hey, thanks for watching to the end of this video. Go ahead and make my day by writing a comment down below. And if you aren't already subscribed, go ahead and do that now if you are a true Screencraft junkie. And speaking of, you know when I was slapping my arm at the beginning of the video? Well, I don't know if you can see this, but I ended up breaking a bunch of capillaries there. So, you know, that's what I do for this channel.